I was sitting in a greasy diner outside Hayward, Wisconsin, when my phone rang with the kind of news that makes your coffee taste like battery acid. My Uncle Raymond, a 73-year-old retired contractor who wouldn't hurt a fly unless it landed on his fishing line, had just been locked out of his own lakefront property by the Whispering Pines HOA. The woman on the other end identified herself as Brenda Patterson, the HOA president, and she spoke with the kind of cheerful authority that makes you want to drive your truck through a wall. "Your uncle has been notified repeatedly about his violations," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The property has been seized in accordance with our bylaws, and he has 24 hours to remove his personal belongings before we auction everything off." I hung up without saying goodbye and immediately called Uncle Raymond. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with anger and something else I rarely heard from him, fear. "Connor, they changed the locks," he said. "I went fishing this morning, came back 3 hours later, and there's a new padlock on my gate and signs all over saying the property is under HOA control. 37 years I've lived here, and some woman who moved in 2 years ago thinks she can just take it." The drive from the diner to Uncle Raymond's place took 40 minutes, but I made it in 30. The property sat on the southern shore of Nelson Lake, a beautiful stretch of water surrounded by thick pine forests and rolling hills. Uncle Raymond had bought the land back in 1988, long before any HOA existed, back when it was just him and a handful of other folks who wanted peace and quiet. He built his cabin himself, a sturdy 2-bedroom structure with a wraparound porch that overlooked the water. He added a dock, a small boathouse, and over the years he collected what some might call an eclectic assortment of equipment: old boats, a vintage tractor, and his pride and joy, a 1997 Caterpillar 320 excavator that still ran like a dream. When I pulled up to the property, I found Uncle Raymond standing outside the locked gate with 2 sheriff's deputies. My uncle was a big man, 6'2", even with the slight stoop age had given him, with weathered hands that could still split firewood for hours. Right now, those hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "Connor," he said when he saw me, "tell these officers that this is my property." The older deputy, a gray-haired man with a sympathetic expression, shook his head. "Sir, we've been through this. The HOA has filed the proper paperwork with the county. Until you get a court order, we can't let you onto the property." "Proper paperwork?" I stepped between my uncle and the deputies. "This is his land. He's owned it for nearly 40 years. What paperwork gives an HOA the right to seize private property?" The younger deputy pulled out a folder and showed me a stack of documents. "The HOA has a lien on the property for unpaid fines totaling $47,000. According to Wisconsin statute, when fines exceed a certain threshold and remain unpaid for more than 90 days, the HOA can take possession of the property to satisfy the debt." I grabbed the folder and started reading. The fines were insane. $3,000 for unauthorized exterior paint color, $5,000 for unapproved landscaping modifications, $10,000 for commercial vehicle storage, which apparently referred to as Excavator. The list went on and on, each violation more ridiculous than the last. "He never agreed to any HOA," I said. "He bought this land before Whispering Pines even existed." The older deputy nodded. "That may be true, but according to these documents, when the neighborhood incorporated as an HOA in 2019, all property owners were automatically enrolled. The bylaws were recorded with the county." Uncle Raymond's face had gone pale. "I never got any notice about that. I never signed anything." "That is something you'll need to take up with a lawyer," the deputy said. "But right now, our hands are tied." The HOA has legal possession until a judge says otherwise. I helped Uncle Raymond into my truck and drove him to my place, a small house I rented about 15 miles away. He sat in silence most of the way, staring out the window at the passing trees. When we finally pulled into my driveway, he turned to me with tears in his eyes. "That cabin has everything, Connor. Your aunt's ashes are scattered in the garden. My photographs, my tools, my whole life is in there. How can they just take it?" "They can't," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "We're going to fight this." The next morning, I started making calls. The first lawyer I contacted, a real estate attorney in Spooner, listened to my explanation and then quoted me a retainer fee of $15,000. The second lawyer, in Rice Lake, said the case would be difficult and expensive, probably running north of $50,000 by the time everything was said and done. Uncle Raymond had savings, but not that kind of money, and his monthly retirement check barely covered his basic expenses. On the third call, I reached Daniel Morrison, a property rights attorney based in Eau Claire. Unlike the others, Morrison didn't immediately start talking about money. He asked detailed questions about the timeline, the HOA formation, and whether Uncle Raymond had ever received proper notice. After 20 minutes, he said something that gave me hope. "This smells wrong," Morrison said. "Wisconsin law requires explicit notice and an opportunity to opt out when an existing neighborhood forms an HOA. If your uncle never received that notice, the entire lien could be invalid. I'll take the case on contingency. If we win, I take 30% of any damages we recover. If we lose, you pay nothing." "When can we meet?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Bring every document your uncle has related to the property." That afternoon, I drove back to Nelson Lake, but instead of going to Uncle Raymond's locked gate, I parked on the public access road that ran along the northern edge of the lake. I walked through the woods until I had a clear view of his property. What I saw made my blood boil. Brenda Patterson, a woman in her late 40s with blonde hair styled into an aggressive bob, was standing on Uncle Raymond's porch with two men in polo shirts emblazoned with Whispering Pines HOA enforcement. They were taking photographs of everything: the old boats, the tractor, the excavator. One of the men was making notes on a tablet. "We should get at least $30,000 for the excavator alone," Brenda said, her voice carrying across the water. "The rest of this junk we can haul to the dump. Once we clear this eyesore, we can flip the property for $400,000, easy." Lakefront property like this, in compliance with our aesthetic standards, will bring in a buyer who actually respects the community. I pulled out my phone and started recording. For the next 10 minutes, I captured Brenda and her goons discussing their plans to sell Uncle Raymond's property and equipment, laughing about how they'd finally gotten rid of the stubborn old coot who refused to follow the rules. When they finally left, I walked back to my truck with a video that might just save everything. The meeting with Morrison the next morning was intense. Uncle Raymond brought a cardboard box filled with documents, every deed, every property tax receipt, every piece of paper related to his land. Morrison spent an hour going through everything, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finished, he looked up with a grim expression. "The HOA filed the incorporation papers with Sawyer County in January 2019, Morrison said. According to Wisconsin statute, they were required to send certified mail to every property owner within the proposed HOA boundaries, informing them of the incorporation and giving them 60 days to opt out. Do you remember receiving anything like that?" Uncle Raymond shook his head. "I was in Florida that whole winter. I've been spending January through March in Tampa with my daughter since my wife passed in 2017. I don't check my mail when I am gone. The post office holds it, and I pick it up when I get back." Morrison made a note. "So if they sent notice in January, you wouldn't have received it until April at the earliest." "That is right. And I never got any certified letter about an HOA. I would have remembered that." "Good," Morrison said. "That is our first argument, defective notice, but we have a bigger problem. Even if the notice was defective, you've been living there since 2019 without challenging the HOA's authority. They could argue you acquiesced to the incorporation through your silence and continued residency." I pulled out my phone and showed Morrison the video I had recorded. His eyes widened as he watched Brenda discussing the sale of the property. "This is gold," Morrison said. "This shows clear intent to profit from the seizure, which could demonstrate that the fines were levied in bad faith. The problem is, we need to act fast. According to the seizure notice, they can sell the property in 30 days if you don't pay the fines or obtain a court order." "What do we do?" Uncle Raymond asked. "We file for an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow morning," Morrison said. "We'll argue defective notice, bad faith enforcement, and unconstitutional taking. The video will help, but I need you to understand something. Even if we win the injunction, this case could take months or even years to fully resolve. Are you prepared for that?" Uncle Raymond looked at me, then back at Morrison. "I've got nowhere else to go. That cabin is my home. I'll fight as long as it takes." Morrison filed the paperwork the next day, but the court system moved like molasses. The earliest we could get a hearing for the emergency injunction was 2 weeks out. In the meantime, Brenda and the HOA weren't sitting still. I started getting reports from Uncle Raymond's neighbors, the few who weren't part of Brenda's clique, that construction crews were coming onto the property, taking measurements and staging equipment. One neighbor, an old-timer named George Sullivan who had known Uncle Raymond for 20 years, called me with disturbing news. "Connor, they're planning to demolish the cabin," George said. "I overheard Brenda talking to a contractor at the marina. She wants it gone before your uncle can get a court order. She figures if the cabin is destroyed, he'll have nothing to fight for and will just walk away." That night, I sat down with Uncle Raymond at my kitchen table. He looked defeated, his shoulders slumped, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Maybe I should just let it go," he said quietly. "I am too old for this fight. Maybe I can find a small apartment somewhere, live out my days in peace." "That is exactly what Brenda wants," I said. "She's counting on you giving up. But Uncle Ray, you taught me to stand up for what is right. You taught me that bullies only win if good people do nothing. Your excavator is still on that property, right?" He nodded slowly. "They haven't been able to move it. The key is on a chain around my neck. That machine weighs 19 tons. They would need a lowboy trailer and a heavy-duty crane to move it, and that costs money they probably don't want to spend yet." An idea started forming in my mind. It was risky, possibly illegal, but it might be our only shot. "What if we take the property back?" I said. Uncle Raymond looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Connor, there are locks. There are probably alarms. The sheriff said we can't go on the property." "The sheriff said you can't go through the front gate," I said, "but that excavator can go anywhere. You taught me how to operate it when I was 16, remember? We spent a whole summer digging drainage ditches and clearing brush. I still remember everything." Understanding dawned in Uncle Raymond's eyes, followed quickly by a spark of his old fire. "The access road on the north side. It's public land, maintained by the county. If someone were to, hypothetically, drive an excavator from the public access road onto the property, they wouldn't be breaking through any HOA locks or gates." "Hypothetically," I agreed. "And if that person were to use the excavator to remove the locks from the inside, allowing the rightful property owner to enter through his own gate. Well, that would just be clearing an obstruction from private property. Hypothetically. Uncle Raymond smiled for the first time in days. "When do we do this?" "Tonight," I said. "Before they can move the excavator or demolish the cabin. We get in, we secure the property, and we make them drag us out in front of cameras and witnesses. Morrison said the video I took shows bad faith. Let's show a judge what we're willing to do to defend what's rightfully yours." We spent the rest of the evening planning. Uncle Raymond drew detailed maps of the property, showing me the best route from the public access road to where the excavator was parked. We packed supplies, flashlights, bolt cutters, chains, and enough food and water to last several days if we needed to barricade ourselves inside the cabin. At midnight, we drove to the public access road in my truck. The night was clear and cold, with a quarter moon providing just enough light to see by. Uncle Raymond handed me the key to the excavator, the metal still warm from hanging against his chest. "Be careful," he said. "That machine has a lot of power. Respect it, and it will do what you need." I made my way through the woods, moving slowly to avoid making noise. The excavator sat where Uncle Raymond had left it, covered by a tarp near the tree line. I pulled off the tarp, climbed into the cab, and slipped the key into the ignition. The engine turned over with a deep rumble that sounded like thunder in the quiet night. I had forgotten how much I loved operating this machine. The responsive controls, the raw power at my fingertips, the way the ground itself seemed to reshape according to my will. I raised the boom, swung the cab around, and started making my way toward the property line. The excavator's tracks chewed through the undergrowth, leaving deep gouges in the soft earth. I crossed from public land onto Uncle Raymond's property, and immediately, motion sensor lights blazed to life. Brenda had installed a security system. Of course she had. I didn't stop. I drove the excavator straight to the main gate where Uncle Raymond was waiting on the other side. The new padlock Brenda had installed was heavy-duty, but it was nothing compared to 19 tons of steel. I positioned the bucket, applied pressure, and the gate frame bent like aluminum foil. The lock popped off and clattered to the ground. Uncle Raymond pushed the gate open and walked onto his property for the first time in days. The look on his face made every risk worth it. "Let's secure the perimeter," I said, climbing down from the excavator. "They'll be here soon." We worked quickly. I used the excavator to push several large logs across the driveway, creating a barricade that would stop any vehicle short of a tank. Uncle Raymond used the bolt cutters to remove the padlocks Brenda had put on the cabin door and the boathouse. We were inside the cabin, with the lights on and coffee brewing, when the headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. Brenda Patterson arrived in a white Lexus SUV, followed by a Sawyer County Sheriff's cruiser. She got out of her car, saw the destroyed gate and the log barricade, and her face turned a shade of red I had previously only seen on cartoon characters. "What do you think you're doing?" She screamed across the barricade. "This is HOA property. You're trespassing." Uncle Raymond stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand. "Brenda, this is my property. Always has been, always will be. You can take your HOA and your illegal lien and discuss it with my lawyer." The sheriff's deputy, the same older officer from before, walked up to the barricade and surveyed the situation. He looked at the excavator, at the destroyed gate, at Uncle Raymond standing on his porch, and I could see him doing the math in his head. "Mr. Mitchell," the deputy said, "you were ordered to stay off this property pending the court case." "I was ordered not to break through the HOA's locks and gates," Uncle Raymond called back. "I didn't touch them." My nephew removed an obstruction from my private property using equipment that was already on site. Last I checked, A man has a right to clear obstacles from his own land. Brenda was practically vibrating with rage. Arrest them. They destroyed HOA property. That gate was installed by the association. Madam, the deputy said patiently, the gate is on Mr. Mitchell's property. If anyone installed a lock on someone else's property without permission, that could be considered vandalism. He owes $47,000 in fines. The lien is legal. That's a civil matter for the courts to decide, the deputy said. Right now, all I see is a property owner standing on his own land. Unless you have a court order specifically barring him from the premises, there's nothing I can do. Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. This isn't over, she finally spat. I'll have you arrested for destruction of property, for trespassing, for everything I can think of. You're finished, old man. Looking forward to seeing you in court, Uncle Raymond said calmly. Brenda screeched something unintelligible, got back in her Lexus and peeled out, her tires spitting gravel. The deputy lingered for a moment, then walked closer to the barricade. Mr. Mitchell, I have to ask, are you planning to stay here? This is my home, Uncle Raymond said. I'm not going anywhere. The deputy nodded slowly. I can't force you to leave without a court order, but I'm going to be honest with you. That woman is going to make your life hell. She'll be back with lawyers and paperwork and everything else she can throw at you. Let her come, Uncle Raymond said. We'll be ready. The deputy got back in his cruiser and left. Uncle Raymond and I stood on the porch, watching the taillights disappear down the road. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, replaced by the reality of what we had just done. We might have just made everything worse, I said. Or we might have just saved everything, Uncle Raymond replied. Time will tell. The first night back in the cabin was peaceful. Uncle Raymond cooked breakfast the next morning, eggs and bacon on his old cast-iron skillet, and we ate on the porch while watching the sun rise over Nelson Lake. It felt like a small victory, a moment of normalcy in the chaos. That peace lasted until 9 in the morning when 3 black SUVs rolled up to the barricade. Brenda Patterson emerged from the first vehicle, along with 4 men in suits. One of them was carrying a briefcase and what looked like court documents. Raymond Mitchell, the man with the briefcase, called out. I'm Stephen Gardner, legal counsel for the Whispering Pines HOA. I have here a temporary restraining order issued by Judge Margaret Holbrook of Sawyer County Circuit Court. You are ordered to vacate this property immediately and to cease all interference with HOA operations. Uncle Raymond walked out to the barricade, and I followed. Morrison had told us this might happen, that Brenda would run to a friendly judge and get an emergency order. The question was whether the order would hold up once Morrison had a chance to challenge it. Let me see that, Uncle Raymond said. Gardner handed over the documents. I read over my uncle's shoulder. The order was broad and devastating. It barred Uncle Raymond from the property, required him to turn over all keys and access codes, and authorized the HOA to use reasonable force to remove him if he didn't comply within 2 hours. Call Morrison, Uncle Raymond said to me quietly. I stepped away and dialed. Morrison answered on the second ring, and I explained the situation. They judge-shopped, Morrison said, anger clear in his voice. Holbrook is known for favoring HOAs. She probably issued the TRO based entirely on the HOA's version of events without hearing your side. I'm filing an emergency motion to dissolve the order right now, but it might take a day or 2 to get a hearing. We don't have a day or 2, I said. They're saying we have 2 hours to leave. Then you need to make a decision, Morrison said. If you stay and they bring the sheriff back with that order, you could be arrested for contempt of court. If you leave, we might not be able to get you back on the property before the HOA does serious damage. I looked at Uncle Raymond. He was staring at the cabin, at the garden where his wife's ashes were scattered, at the dock where he'd spent countless mornings fishing. I knew what his decision would be before he said it. "We're staying," I told Morrison. "I figured," Morrison said. "Here's what you do. Document everything. If they try to remove you by force, film it. If they damage anything, film it. The more evidence we have of the HOA's overreach, the better our case. I'll get that motion filed within the hour." Gardner was getting impatient. "Well, are you going to comply with the court order?" "We're going to need more time to consult with our attorney," Uncle Raymond said. "You have 2 hours," Gardner snapped. "After that, we're bringing in the sheriff and you'll be removed in handcuffs if necessary." The next 2 hours were a blur of phone calls and preparation. Morrison filed his emergency motion and got a hearing scheduled for the following morning. George Sullivan, the neighbor who had warned us about Brenda's demolition plans, came by with 3 other neighbors who supported Uncle Raymond. They set up lawn chairs on the public side of the property line, holding signs that said, "Support Ray Mitchell" and "HOA overreach." Local news got wind of the situation. A reporter from the Sawyer County Record arrived with a photographer, asking questions about the dispute. Uncle Raymond gave them the whole story, from the questionable HOA incorporation to the massive fines to Brenda's plans to flip the property. I showed the reporter my video of Brenda discussing the sale. "This is a huge story," the reporter, a young woman named Jessica Chen, said. "David versus Goliath, individual property rights versus HOA power. Can I interview you on camera?" "Absolutely," Uncle Raymond said. The interview was still going on when Brenda returned with sheriff's deputies. The older deputy from before was there, along with 2 others. He did not look happy about the situation. "Mr. Mitchell," the deputy said, "I have a court order requiring you to vacate the property. I don't want to arrest you, but I will if I have to." Uncle Raymond stood his ground. "Deputy, that order was issued without giving me a chance to present my side. My attorney has filed a motion to dissolve it. We have a hearing tomorrow morning. Can't we just wait for the judge to hear both sides?" The deputy looked at the cameras, at the neighbors with their signs, at Brenda standing behind him with her arms crossed and a satisfied expression on her face. I could see him weighing his options. "I have to enforce the order," he said finally. "But I can give you until tomorrow morning to gather your belongings and make arrangements. If Judge Holbrook doesn't dissolve the order by noon tomorrow, you'll need to leave peacefully, or I'll have no choice but to arrest you." It wasn't much, but it was something. Uncle Raymond nodded. "Thank you for being reasonable." Brenda wasn't having it. "That order says immediately. You need to remove him now." The deputy turned to her with barely concealed irritation. "Madam, I'm exercising my discretion to allow the respondent time to comply in an orderly fashion. If you have a problem with that, you can file a complaint with my supervisor." Brenda looked like she wanted to argue, but Gardner put a hand on her shoulder and whispered something in her ear. She got back in her SUV without another word, but the look she gave Uncle Raymond could have melted steel. That evening, Morrison called with an update. "I've been digging into the HOA's incorporation documents. There are some serious irregularities. For one thing, the notice they claim to have sent to all property owners was dated January 15, 2019, but it wasn't filed with the county until February 28. That's a 6-week gap, which suggests the notices might have been backdated. Can you prove that?" I asked. "I'm working on it. I've subpoenaed the certified mail receipts from the post office. If those receipts show the notices were actually mailed in late February, after the opt-out period had already expired, then the entire HOA incorporation could be void. But it's going to take time to get those records." "We might not have time," I said. If the judge doesn't dissolve the restraining order tomorrow, Ray has to leave the property. Then we need to make sure the judge dissolves it, Morrison said. I've prepared a motion with all our evidence, including the video you took. I'm going to argue that the HOA's actions constitute an unconstitutional taking without due process, and that the fines were levied in bad faith to create a pretext for seizing valuable lakefront property. If I can convince Holbrook to at least hear our side, we have a fighting chance. The hearing the next morning was in the Sawyer County Courthouse in Hayward. Uncle Raymond wore his best suit, a navy blue number that he'd last worn to his wife's funeral. Morrison met us outside the courtroom, carrying a thick accordion folder full of documents. Here's how this is going to go, Morrison said. They'll present their argument for why the restraining order should remain in place. I'll present our argument for why it should be dissolved. The judge will make a decision, probably right there on the spot. Be prepared for anything. Judge Margaret Holbrook was a severe-looking woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and a no-nonsense expression. She listened impassively as Gardner argued that Uncle Raymond was a scofflaw who had willfully violated HOA regulations for years, accumulated massive fines, and then used heavy machinery to illegally re-enter the property after it had been lawfully seized. The HOA has followed every procedure required by Wisconsin law, Gardner said. Mr. Mitchell was given ample notice of the violations and fines. He chose to ignore them. The association had no choice but to place a lien on the property, and when that lien went unpaid, to take possession to satisfy the debt. Mr. Mitchell's use of an excavator to destroy HOA property and re-enter the premises was a clear act of intimidation and vandalism. The restraining order is necessary to prevent further destruction and to allow the HOA to proceed with the lawful sale of the property. When Morrison stood up, he immediately went on the offensive. Your Honor, the HOA's narrative is built on a foundation of procedural violations and bad faith. My client never received proper notice when the Whispering Pines HOA was incorporated in 2019. Wisconsin law requires certified mail to all affected property owners, with a 60-day opt-out period. Mr. Mitchell was in Florida during the notice period and never received any such notification. Furthermore, we have evidence suggesting the incorporation notices were backdated. He submitted the documents showing the gap between the notice date and the filing date. Gardner objected, arguing that the notices were properly sent, but Morrison pressed on. More troubling, Your Honor, is the nature of the fines themselves. $47,000 for violations such as unauthorized paint color and unapproved landscaping. These are clearly pretextual fines designed to create a debt large enough to justify seizure. And I have video evidence showing HOA President Brenda Patterson discussing plans to sell Mr. Mitchell's property for a profit. Morrison played the video on a laptop. In the quiet courtroom, Brenda's voice rang out clearly. We should get at least $30,000 for the excavator alone. Once we clear this eyesore, we can flip the property for $400,000. Easy. Judge Holbrook's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of surprise or perhaps disapproval. Gardner was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, that video was taken without permission on private property. It should be excluded. Mr. Gardner, the video was taken from public land, Morrison countered. It's admissible. And it shows exactly what this case is really about. This isn't about HOA compliance. It's about a coordinated effort to seize valuable lakefront property from an elderly man who's lived there for 37 years. The judge leaned back in her chair, studying the documents in front of her. The courtroom was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. "Mr. Gardner," Judge Holbrook said finally, "I'm troubled by this video. It suggests a motive beyond simple fee collection. I'm also concerned about the notice issue. Mr. Morrison, you claim your client never received proper notice of the HOA incorporation." "That's correct, Your Honor. He was out of state during the entire notice period, and pickup up his held mail only after the opt-out period had expired. And you have evidence of this." Morrison submitted Uncle Raymond's credit card statements showing charges in Florida from January through March 2019, along with an affidavit from the post office confirming that Raymond Mitchell had placed his mail on hold during that period. Judge Holbrook reviewed the evidence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she looked up. "I'm dissolving the temporary restraining order," she said. "Mr. Mitchell may remain on his property pending a full hearing on the validity of the HOA lien and the incorporation itself. That hearing will be scheduled for 3 weeks from today. Mr. Gardner, your client is not to interfere with Mr. Mitchell's possession of the property in the meantime. Any violations of this order will result in contempt charges. Are we clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Gardner said stiffly. Outside the courthouse, Uncle Raymond actually hugged Morrison, something I'd never seen my reserved uncle do with anyone except family. "Thank you," Uncle Raymond said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my home." "We're not done yet," Morrison cautioned. "The full hearing is in 3 weeks. We need to use that time to build an airtight case. The post office records, witness testimony from your neighbors, everything we can find to show the HOA incorporation was flawed and the fines were levied in bad faith." Over the next 3 weeks, Morrison worked like a man possessed. He obtained the certified mail records from the post office, which showed that several notices had indeed been mailed weeks after the date printed on them. He took depositions from neighbors who testified that they had never received incorporation notices either. He hired a property appraiser who confirmed that Uncle Raymond's lakefront parcel, if cleared and developed according to HOA standards, could easily sell for $400,000 or more. Meanwhile, I stayed at the cabin with Uncle Raymond, partly to help him prepare for the hearing, and partly because we both knew Brenda wasn't going to take the dissolved restraining order lying down. Sure enough, HOA compliance officers started driving by the property multiple times a day, taking photographs and making notes. Brenda filed noise complaints with the county, claiming Uncle Raymond's generator was too loud, even though he only ran it during the day when power was needed for tools. She filed a complaint with the DNR claiming he was illegally modifying the shoreline, even though he hadn't touched the lake in months. Every complaint was investigated and dismissed, but they served their purpose of harassment and intimidation. Uncle Raymond took it in stride, but I could see the stress wearing on him. He looked older, more tired. One evening, George Sullivan came by with interesting news. "Brenda's in trouble," George said. "I've been talking to some of the other HOA members, the ones who aren't part of her inner circle. Turns out she's been skimming money from the HOA budget. A lot of money. We're talking tens of thousands over the past 2 years. Some folks are calling for her removal as president, and there's talk of involving the police." "How sure are you about this?" I asked. "Pretty sure," George said. "One of the HOA board members, Ted Larson, he's an accountant. He started noticing discrepancies in the quarterly reports. Payments to vendors that don't exist, reimbursements for expenses that were never incurred. He's been documenting everything, and he's willing to testify if it comes to that." I called Morrison immediately and relayed what George had told me. Morrison was quiet for a moment, then said, "If we can prove financial malfeasance by the HOA president, it goes a long way toward showing the lien on Raymond's property was part of a broader pattern of corruption." Can you get me in touch with this Ted Larson?" Within days, Morrison had a meeting with Ted Larson and two other HOA board members who were concerned about Brenda's management. They provided bank statements, invoices, and email correspondence showing a systematic pattern of embezzlement. Brenda had been funneling HOA funds into her personal accounts using fake vendor invoices and inflated expense reports. "This is criminal," Morrison said after reviewing the documents. "We need to report this to law enforcement." Ted Larson shook his head. "We want to, but we're worried about retaliation. Brenda has connections in the county. Her brother is a county commissioner. If we go to the local sheriff, there's no guarantee anything will happen." "Then we go to the state," Morrison said. "The Wisconsin Department of Justice has a fraud unit that investigates exactly this kind of thing. And once there's a criminal investigation, it puts pressure on the civil case." Morrison filed a complaint with the DOJ, submitting all the evidence Ted Larson and the other board members had gathered. Within a week, two investigators showed up at the HOA office requesting to see the financial records. Brenda tried to stonewall them, but when they showed up with a subpoena, she had no choice but to comply. The investigators spent 3 days going through every transaction, every invoice, every receipt. By the end of their review, they had identified over $80,000 in fraudulent charges. Brenda Patterson was arrested on charges of theft by fraud, embezzlement, and misconduct in public office. The arrest made the local news, and suddenly the story of Uncle Raymond's property dispute became much bigger. Jessica Chen from the Sawyer County Record wrote a follow-up article connecting Brenda's embezzlement to the questionable lien on Uncle Raymond's property. The headline read, "HOA President Arrested for Embezzlement, Property Seizure Under Investigation." With Brenda under arrest and the HOA in disarray, Morrison saw an opportunity. He filed an emergency motion to dismiss the lien on Uncle Raymond's property, arguing that the entire enforcement action had been orchestrated by a president now facing criminal charges for financial fraud. The hearing on the motion was scheduled for the same day as the full hearing on the original case. Judge Holbrook consolidated both matters into a single proceeding. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers. Uncle Raymond sat at the plaintiff's table, looking more confident than I'd seen him in weeks. Brenda Patterson was not in court. She was out on bail but facing serious criminal charges, and the HOA had suspended her from all duties pending the outcome of the investigation. Instead, the HOA was represented by a new attorney, a younger woman named Patricia Stone who looked deeply uncomfortable with the case she'd inherited. Morrison presented his case methodically. He started with the defective incorporation notices, showing that Uncle Raymond and several other property owners had never received proper notification. He moved on to the excessive and pretextual fines, demonstrating that they bore no reasonable relationship to any actual harm caused by Uncle Raymond's alleged violations. He presented the video of Brenda discussing the property sale, proving the lien was motivated by profit rather than legitimate enforcement. And finally, he introduced the evidence of Brenda's embezzlement, arguing that it showed a pattern of corruption that tainted every action she had taken as HOA president. "Your Honor," Morrison concluded, "this case represents everything that's wrong with unchecked HOA power." An elderly man who has owned his property for nearly 4 decades was targeted by a corrupt HOA president who saw an opportunity to seize valuable lakefront land. The fines were pretextual, the lien was illegal, and the entire enforcement action was tainted by financial fraud. I'm asking this court to dissolve the lien invalidate the HOA's claim to the property, and award damages to Mr. Mitchell for the emotional distress and legal expenses he's been forced to endure. Patricia Stone did her best to defend the HOA's position, but her heart clearly wasn't in it. She argued that regardless of Brenda's criminal conduct, the HOA had followed proper procedures in levying fines and placing the lien. But when Judge Holbrook pressed her on the excessive nature of the fines and the defective incorporation notices, Stone had no good answers. Judge Holbrook took a brief recess to review the evidence, then returned with her decision. "I've reviewed all the evidence and arguments presented by both sides," the judge said. "I find that the Whispering Pines HOA failed to provide proper notice to Mr. Mitchell and several other property owners when it incorporated in 2019. Under Wisconsin law, this is a fatal defect that renders the incorporation invalid as to those property owners who did not receive notice. Mr. Mitchell cannot be bound by an HOA he was never properly informed about and never had the opportunity to opt out of." Uncle Raymond gripped my arm, his fingers tight with hope and tension. "Furthermore," Judge Holbrook continued, "I find that the fines levied against Mr. Mitchell were excessive, pretextual, and motivated by improper purposes. The evidence shows that former HOA President Brenda Patterson intended to seize Mr. Mitchell's property for resale at a substantial profit. This is not a legitimate use of HOA enforcement power. Accordingly, I am dissolving the lien on Mr. Mitchell's property in its entirety. The HOA has no claim to the land, the structures, or any personal property located thereon." The courtroom erupted in applause from Uncle Raymond's supporters. The judge banged her gavel for order. "Additionally," Judge Holbrook said, "I am awarding Mr. Mitchell compensatory damages in the amount of $35,000 to cover his legal expenses, emotional distress, and the value of improvements he was unable to make to his property while this dispute was ongoing. The Whispering Pines HOA will pay these damages within 90 days. If the HOA wishes to appeal this decision, they may do so, but the lien remains dissolved pending any appeal." Morrison shook Uncle Raymond's hand, then mine. "We won," he said simply. Outside the courthouse, Uncle Raymond was swarmed by neighbors and well-wishers. George Sullivan clapped him on the back. Ted Larson apologized for the HOA's actions and promised that the board would work to reform the organization's practices. Jessica Chen interviewed Uncle Raymond for a follow-up article that would eventually win her a state journalism award. But the story wasn't quite over. 2 months later, Brenda Patterson went to trial on the embezzlement charges. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and after a 3-day trial, the jury found her guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution of $83,000 to the HOA. During the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor read a statement from Uncle Raymond. "Brenda Patterson tried to take everything from me, my home, my memories, my peace of mind. She abused her position of power to enrich herself at the expense of the community she was supposed to serve. I hope this sentence sends a message that HOA leaders are not above the law, and that property owners have rights that must be respected." The Whispering Pines HOA underwent significant reforms after Brenda's conviction. Ted Larson was elected the new president, and the board voted to reduce the fine structure to reasonable levels, improve transparency in financial reporting, and establish an appeals process for property owners who felt they were being unfairly targeted. Several property owners who had never received incorporation notices, like Uncle Raymond, were given the option to opt out of the HOA entirely. Most of them took it. Uncle Raymond's property was never threatened again. He lived in his cabin on Nelson Lake for another 6 years, spending his days fishing, maintaining his equipment, and enjoying the peace he had fought so hard to preserve. I visited him every weekend, and we often talked about the excavator that had saved his home. "That machine was the best investment I ever made," Uncle Raymond would say. "Paid for itself 100 times over." When Uncle Raymond passed away in the summer of 2031, he left the property to me in his will. I seriously considered moving there permanently, but my job kept me closer to the city. Instead, I turned the cabin into a vacation rental, with all proceeds going to a legal defense fund Morrison had established to help other property owners fight abusive HOAs. The excavator still sits on the property, a monument to one old man's refusal to be bullied. I keep it in good working condition, and every time I visit, I fire it up and do a little work around the land, clearing brush, maintaining the driveway, and remembering the night I drove it through the woods to reclaim what was rightfully ours. Morrison's Legal Defense Fund has helped dozens of property owners across Wisconsin fight back against HOA overreach. He still takes cases on contingency, and he's won more than he's lost. The video I took of Brenda discussing the property sale has been used in legal seminars as an example of how to document HOA bad faith. As for Brenda Patterson, she served 3 years of her 4-year sentence and was released in 2028. Last I heard, she moved to Arizona and was working as a retail manager. I hope she learned something from the experience, but I'm not holding my breath. The legacy of Uncle Raymond's fight lives on in Wisconsin property law. The case, Mitchell v. Whispering Pines HOA, is now cited as precedent in disputes over HOA incorporation notice requirements. The state legislature even passed a law in 2027 requiring more stringent notice procedures and limiting the amount of fines an HOA can levy for aesthetic violations. Sometimes I sit on the porch of Uncle Raymond's cabin, watching the sun set over Nelson Lake, and I think about how close we came to losing it all. A few more days, a less determined lawyer, a less sympathetic judge, and that cabin would have been demolished, the land cleared, and everything Uncle Raymond built over 37 years would have been erased. But it wasn't. Because one stubborn old man refused to give up, because his nephew was willing to drive an excavator through the woods in the middle of the night, and because a good lawyer believed in fighting for what was right even when the odds seemed impossible. The excavator is still there, ready if anyone ever tries to take what belongs to us again. But I don't think they will. The story of how Uncle Raymond reclaimed his property with nothing but determination, heavy machinery, and the law on his side has become something of a legend around Nelson Lake. New HOA boards think twice before they try to bully property owners, and people remember what happened to the last person who thought she could seize someone's home for profit. Uncle Raymond's garden still blooms every spring, and I've scattered some of my own memories there alongside his wife's ashes. The dock where he spent countless mornings fishing is still sturdy, and I've caught a few good walleye there myself. The cabin is exactly as he left it, filled with his tools, his photographs, and the quiet dignity of a life well lived. Every time I drive up to that property and see the gate, Uncle Raymond's gate, standing open and welcoming, I remember what it took to keep it that way. I remember the fear in his voice when he called to tell me the HOA had seized his home. I remember the determination in his eyes when he decided to fight back. And I remember the sound of that excavator engine rumbling to life in the darkness, ready to move mountains if that's what it took. Some people say we were lucky, that we could have ended up in jail or lost everything. Maybe they're right, but luck only gets you so far. The rest is courage, conviction, and the willingness to stand up against people who think their power makes them untouchable. Brenda Patterson learned the hard way that it doesn't. Uncle Raymond taught her that lesson with an excavator and a lawyer, and it's a lesson that will echo through Sawyer County for generations to come. The cabin on Nelson Lake stands as proof that sometimes the little guy wins. Sometimes David beats Goliath. Sometimes justice prevails and the bullies end up in handcuffs while the victim gets to go home. Uncle Raymond got to go home. He got to live out his years in the place he loved, surrounded by memories and peace. And when his time came, he left this world knowing he had fought the good fight and won. That excavator is still ready, still waiting, still a reminder that no matter how powerful they think they are, there are some things worth fighting for and some men who will never back down. Uncle Raymond was one of those men, and I'm proud to be his nephew, proud to be the guardian of his legacy, and proud to know that his story will inspire others to stand up for their rights. The sun sets over Nelson Lake every evening, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. The cabin still stands, solid and true, and somewhere in the distance, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the rumble of an excavator engine, ready to defend what matters most: home, family, justice. These are the things worth fighting for, and these are the things Uncle Raymond taught me to never surrender, no matter what the HOA says, no matter what papers they wave around, and no matter how many locks they put on your gate, because in the end, truth wins. Right wins. And sometimes, an excavator and a good lawyer are all you need to prove it.